Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Computer History Museum. Very exciting to see everyone here tonight and those online as we stream the program. My name's Daniel Lewin. I'm the CEO of the museum. Been here a little more than 5 years. I'm very excited for this program tonight for all sorts of reasons, not the least of which is the topic, but also its relevance to the mission of the institution. We have evolved our mission to focus on decoding technology, the computing past, the digital present, and the future implications on the human condition. And as you all know, life doesn't exist without computing. It's just the way of the world. And so we hope through these programs and these outreach efforts to inform the digital citizens, which is everyone that we will reach, that their actions every day have an impact on the history of computing. And hopefully they'll learn something, and that's cornerstone of us at the museum and our goal as an educational institution. With that in mind, I want to make a point and focus on the theme of this program tonight, and I want to thank Mitch and Freada Kapor for their support along the way. They've been a wonderful friend of the museum, and I get to say this on a personal note, having met Mitch in 1981 or so it's been a long time. And their work in the area that aligns with the museum's interest in diversity and inclusion. We call it IDEA, inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility, access of all kinds, people of all abilities and shades and colors and different groups. So from the standpoint of the program tonight, this is really hitting the sweet spot of what we really care about. There's just no question about that. I'm very excited about the program, as I mentioned, with Mitch and Freada, but also Liz Carey and Troy Cosey, who will be organizing a conversation that will be introduced by Marguerite Gong-Hancock, who leads the programming effort inside of the institution. And before I exit the stage, I just want to make sure that everyone is aware of the book that Mitch and Freada wrote that we're very excited to be presenting here tonight. So again, Marguerite, please, thank you.
Well, good evening and welcome. I'm really thrilled to add my welcome to each of you. And before we jump into the program, I'm going to give you an opportunity to participate. So if you have, whether you're here in person or online, you can pull out your phone. Tonight we're going to have a chance for you to add your voice through polls and questions. So you can pull out your phone, scan the QR code there, go ahead and give it a try. And you'll see two tabs at the top. One will say polls, the other Q&A. Troy, as our moderator along the way, will cue you to a couple of polls that you can add your voice on. And then if you'd like to add a question or vote up somebody else's question, go ahead and do that on the platform as well. And then at the end, please help us learn by giving your feedback on the survey. So now on to our program. You'll know how this works when it's time. So we've titled tonight's program Equalizing Equity. As we know, venture-backed companies have had grow and have had billions of dollars of impact, whether it's through profits or products and sales, but the results or the benefits have not been spread equitably. And so really our question today is, how can we equalize equity? How can we make those benefits more inclusive to those who really deserve and can benefit? So in that, in the startup ecosystem, there are founders, there are VCs, and there are limited partners. And tonight, we're really fortunate to have all three views on stage. And we've seen in some of the recent data, for example, January Ventures survey of more than 400 founders that was just released in the US, bringing data from the US and Europe. It really underscored the kind of headwinds that female founders and founders of color are seeing. So as you can see here, for every dollar that men raise at the early stage, women raise an average of 37 cents, and black women an average of 2 cents. In 2023, 71% of female founders felt that their gender had held them back as an entrepreneur, a 5-year high. And 49% of Black and Latinx founders reported pausing their fundraising or facing issues raising capital. So this is not okay. This is not the world we want to live in. And so what can we do about it? Here on stage, we have people who are thinking about it, who are taking concerted action. and have really concrete ideas on what we can do to make a difference. And so we're really grateful to hear from them and their experience. So first, I'd like to introduce Freada Kapor Klein. She's an entrepreneur, an activist focused on organizational culture and diversity. She's founding partner of Kapor Capital and co-chair of Kapor Center, which strives to make the technology ecosystem diverse and inclusive. She co-founded the first organization in the US to address sexual harassment and founded Smash.org. Really glad to have a Smash scholar here tonight as well, as some of the underrepresented students of color thrive in STEM. This year, she and Mitch co-authored this book, Closing the Equity Gap. So, as is tradition here, let me use 5 numbers to help you get to know her better. 1976 was the year she co-founded the Alliance Against Sexual Coercion. 2001, the year she founded the Level Playing Field Institute. 2023, the year elected to the board of the NAACP. 100, the percent of SMASH scholars admitted to college over 20 years. And 24, the number of years happily married to Mitch. So please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Freada Kapor Klein. So glad you're here.
Thank you.
All right, next up, it's my pleasure to introduce Mitch Kapor, widely known as the founder of Lotus Development Corporation, the designer of Lotus 123 spreadsheet that made the IBM personal computer ubiquitous in the business world in the 1980s. Of course, also founding co-chair of the Mozilla Foundation and co-chair of Kapor Center now, and also founding partner of Kapor Capital. And here are Mitch's 5 numbers. 1, 2, 3, Lotus's killer app. 1990, the year he co-founded the Electronic Frontier Foundation. 1996, that he became a CHM fellow. You could see him honored here and as one of our pioneering computer pioneers. 100, the percent of companies in Kapor Capital that are closing gaps of access or opportunity. And 3.14159. He just likes pie. So join me in welcoming Mitch Kapor to the stage. Glad you're here, Mitch. All right, to help us broaden our perspective, we're really delighted to introduce Liz Carey. She's Executive Vice President of Finance and Operations at Silicon Valley Community Foundation, the largest charitable foundation here in the Valley. She oversees investment, finances, business strategy, and IT. Previously, she was with the Oregon Community Foundation, where she launched the first statewide impact investment fund and Oregon's first social impact bond. And here are her 5 numbers. 61% of the foundation's commingled assets are invested with diverse managers. Did you hear that? 61%. 39 countries that she's worked in supporting philanthropic ventures, $2.6 billion granted in 2022, 53,187 grants awarded since the beginning of the COVID pandemic, and 5 other females in her household, including 1 dog, 1 cat, 2 daughters, and a very patient and accommodating wife. Join me in welcoming Liz Carey. Glad you're here, Liz. All right, now for this chair, we're so thrilled to have Troy Cosey. He'll be wearing 2 hats tonight, both as a speaker, as a founder, and also as a moderator. So he's a native of Oakland. He co-founded Strive. I just loved hearing the story of him as a startup entrepreneur. This is a Kapor Capital-backed learning platform to help companies develop managers and underrepresented talent, which was subsequently acquired by Franklin Covey. Currently, he's the head of platform at Kapor Capital, leading a team to provide advising support and resources to 30-plus funds and 1,000, actually 1,400, he told me today, startups inside the center's investment portfolio. So here are his 5 numbers. There's got to be a story behind this one. 10,373 beach balls that he sent to the wrong San Diego Target in his first job. 10% skill improvement among all Strive learners, which is 5 times the industry standard. 500 LinkedIn influencers acquired in building LinkedIn's influencer program. And 2,000 members of the Black Inclusion Group, LinkedIn's largest employee resource group. And so I to 55, the family distance traveled, which is explained in Mitch and Freada's book, is a very important kind of metric of how we think about people. So please give me a very warm welcome to Troy Cosey. All right, Troy.
Thank you so much. So
Over to you.
thrilled. I feel like I need like walkout music after that, seriously. And the story behind the beach ball, so I'll start there. So my first job out of college was working at Target. I was working in the corporate division, running all of core camping, with the great irony being that I had never been camping before. And so beach balls was an end cap that I had to send to all the stores in the nation. I accidentally sent 60% of the supply nationally to one store, so here we are. But that is some time ago. That is then, and today is now. So thrilled to be here today for this kind of esteemed panel and terrific conversation. Maybe before we get the conversation kicked off here, I'd love to invite our first prompt here on stage, where we will ask for some audience participation. So to get us kicked off here, pull up your Slidos. And the first question is, do you think the Silicon Valley is becoming more equitable, less equitable, or C, stuck in the status quo? Wow, look at that live. It looks to be less equitable. Huh. And it's moving dynamically. I'm almost curious to pull the audience onto why, but that's great to anchor the conversation today, because I really do think it gives a great sense of where everybody is and a topic that's like incredibly important to everybody that's on stage. So maybe just a quick introduction of myself. So as I was so kindly introduced earlier, my name's Troy Cosey. I come to this work really with a professional mission of helping use technology to economically empower underrepresented communities. And I'm on stage today to help paint a picture of what that might look like in the future with these three folks here. We are going to dive into some great conversation really about impact. And one kind of topic that I want you all to keep in mind that we'll certainly unearth and explore more is this concept of, is impact concessionary, right? Can you do well and can you do good? Can you balance profits with purpose? These are questions that for years people have had some pretty distinct points of view around, and we're here to maybe paint the other side of it. So with that, I'd love to kick it off and actually pass it over to our panel here. So let's get to know our panel a little bit more. The first question I'd love to ask, and Freada, maybe we'll start with you, is, reflecting on each of your journeys, what was the moment that you realized that closing the gap was a real pressing problem that was worthy of some attention?
I can't remember that long ago. I'm old. It's really been part of the fabric of who I am, which is I really was raised with and acted on a belief that none of us are free until all of us are free. And so I've always been interested in closing gaps because we are all interconnected. And so it's taken me through many journeys in life, from starting the first group on sexual harassment to being a venture capitalist, but that is a through line.
Thank you so much. Mitch, what about you?
Well, I think folks know I was a tech entrepreneur back in the day, and like a lot of other entrepreneurs, have done a ton of angel investing pretty well. And at a certain point, Freada really started nudging me, like, how come, or what about if you invested in line with what I know your values to be and where your philanthropy is? And my immediate reaction, I'm slightly embarrassed to say, is, oh God, well, if I do that, I'm going to miss out on all the hot deals. So I'm sympathetic when I hear other entrepreneurs say that. But we're both pragmatic and we're both empirical. She has the PhD in research, I don't, but we decided to do an experiment, and she can be very persuasive. What if we just invested in companies that we thought were going to do well economically, but also 100% closed gaps of access or opportunity or outcome in low-income communities or communities of color? And that was the genesis of the Kapor Capital experiment, which is what it was, because we didn't know what would happen. But as soon as we started doing that, it became a self-reinforcing sort of dynamic, which is to say entrepreneurs, founders kind of came out of the woods and said, we're so glad you're doing that. We want, you in our deal. And that was really the turning point. We can talk about the results, but it was all started on a very empirical, we didn't know if this would work, and we have the results to show that it does.
That's great, and we'll come back to the results because they're really noteworthy and certainly the kind of the genesis for why we're all here today in many ways. Liz, what about yourself? How did you kind of come into this work?
Sure. I think there are things that you can't unsee. When you try to look and see, is there an equity gap? Is there a gap here? I can speak from personal experience as a woman in finance and how many meetings I go into and how many times am I the only woman there. Now add, I'm definitely the only queer woman there because I'm the only woman there. And you go through your day, going into business meetings and seeing no one else looks like you. No, you're the one thing that doesn't match the other things in this room. And when you're that person, you think about who else isn't in this room. Why are there no people of color in this room? Why are there certain people who aren't part of the decision making? And I think once you see that and you recognize that, you can't unsee it. You can't walk into a room and say, oh, hey, everybody looks the same in this room. All these decision makers are making decisions that are funding people who also look like them, people who also came, summer in Nantucket with them. That's the kind of folks who are getting the funding. And for me, that's when there's markets out there that we're not touching. There's opportunity there. There's use cases that people haven't even conceived because they're all kind of swimming in the same temperature pool.
That's great. Thank you so much for sharing. Now, I find that this conversation often lacks nuance, right? The great kind of irony around, hey, is this mutually exclusive concessionary concessionary impact? I think D&I tends to be this initiative, even at the corporate level, that we kind of put over here to the side, but when we really sharpen our pencils and make real decisions at real moments, it's one of the first line items to go. But in reality, the facts say otherwise, right? There's a McKinsey study recently that said that in the workplace, companies in the top quartile of racial and ethnic diversity are 35% more likely to have financial outcomes that are better than their peers, right? If we move over to the investing world, for instance, KKR, they just finished raising a $2.3 billion impact fund, the second of its kind. On the heels of its first fund, which was the highest performing fund in the entire portfolio versus 16 other funds, right? So the proof is in the pudding, but the laggards seem to be kind of all around us. So I think my question is, in this landscape, talking a little bit more to the success around the Kapor Capital experiment, what made you build conviction in this notion that, hey, impact investing is not concessionary?
Well, as Mitch said, it was a hypothesis that we were going to test out, and we did that. And I am trained as a researcher, and my doctoral dissertation was 20,000 research subjects, and that's when I learned to code, because there weren't personal computers that could handle it back then. So we really wanted to see if a company's core purpose was about gap closing for low-income communities, communities of color. It had to be tech, had to be startup, had to be what we would think of as venture scale, but the core business had to address those gaps. So it couldn't have a business model that relied on wealthy consumers. If you charge money that most families can't afford, we're not interested. We don't care what the product is, we're not interested. It is by definition gap widening. Anything that lets privileged folks with means, buy their way to the front of the line, that's gap widening in our view. So as Mitch said, we were actually really pleasantly surprised how many entrepreneurs came forward, how many really great deals we got in that other firms our size would never get in, and people would routinely, the past dozen years, reach out and say, I'm oversubscribed, but I want values alignment on my cap table.
If I could annotate two things. One, we came to see that the conventional wisdom is really misguided, we come to believe, in multiple ways. I would say the first is that from a conventional point of view, there's regular investments, and then there's your impact sideshow over here. Well, the way we look at it is all businesses have an impact on their communities, on the environment, on the quality of life. Some is gap narrowing, gap closing, we like those. A lot of them are actually gap widening. So we don't think that there is as much room to say, well, we're just not playing in that space, we're doing fine. It's like in the 60s, they used to say, if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. And I think that's the case. Our analysis goes to what's the core purpose of the business? If this business succeeds, who's going to be better off and who's going to be worse off? So we ask some probing questions. A second way I would say that the conventional wisdom needs to be rethought a little bit has to do with having a very sharp definition of impact. Because we think, for instance, the business model that says, well, if you buy one, we'll give one away for free, it, on the one hand, has some merit, but on the other hand, if conditions change, it is so easy to sever that, just drop that completely, and there goes the impact.
Right.
What we look for are businesses where the same engine of value creation simultaneously creates the economic value and the social value so that they can't be pulled apart. So we take a different approach to looking at, what's gap closing, what's gap widening, what's the core purpose, and we look for things that the more business it does, the more impact it has. So it's not an abstract, it's woven into the entire investment process of the deal sourcing, decision making, and how we support companies.
That's great, and a real groundbreaking methodology that you talk a lot about in the book. Liz, I'd love to learn a little bit from your perspective. How does this notion kind of inform your own thesis with investing on the philanthropic side?
Yeah, I think for us, let's take the Hippocratic oath of investing. Do no harm, and when you can add value, add value. And for us, we're a grant-making organization. Our mission is to improve life in Silicon Valley. And if our investments widen gaps, then that means we have to do more grant-making to try to fill those gaps. That's self-defeating. So if we then take a different approach and we say, okay, let's look at our entire balance sheet, and how can we deploy more of this capital to actually try to close those gaps, then it makes our work easier and it helps us meet our mission. And so that's kind of how we're approaching it, is just really thinking through, there's the one side of grant making, but there's so many more resources that we have, and if we can just harness them and utilize them for that same mission, it should have a greater impact.
That's great. And I think it's important to zoom out and actually think about the ecosystem as a whole, right? As was so lovely teed up at the beginning of this session, you have the entrepreneurial ecosystem, you have the funders and direct investment, and then you have the funders and LP investment. Turning to the LP side a bit, what are some of the challenges that you've seen on that side of the table? Maybe Mitch, let's start with you because you're snickering a little bit.
Well, only because there's just so much irony here. There was a very well-known institution of higher education located not 10 miles from here, which I shall not name. And some colleagues of ours a number of years ago who were just starting their first fund of what has become a very successful ed tech venture fund went and pitched the endowment management of this unnamed university. And they got a flat no because, well, we just don't think you can, we don't invest in education. Oh, really? So this church-state separation between foundations and universities, on the one hand, between the mission of the institution itself and what it's supposed to be doing, and the people who manage money, it's like an absolute wall sometimes. And that's just, it's ironic. So when it comes to getting people to allocate capital to this, the decision makers in those institutions, they are operating under a set of beliefs that we think are just extraordinarily misguided, and it is just a large and constant battle.
Liz, I see you shaking your head. Anything to add?
I agree. I think there's gatekeepers. So when the LPs come, there's all of this, there's a whole system of due diligence and making sure that they make the cut. And first it's fund size, but that's a self-defeating process, right? You can't raise the money unless you can get somebody to invest in your fund, and if you're not big enough, no one will invest in your fund. So that's the first thing. Then you have these institutional investors that are guiding the foundation, and they're motivated sort of to be average, right? Because if they're average, they're not going to get fired. But that means they don't take risk, and they don't go for that first fund. They want to wait for the third fund. And it just cuts off a lot of opportunity for folks to enter this market or enter into the investment space, because they're not able to get past that sort of gauntlet of diligence.
Absolutely. Freada, anything to add there?
Well, I think what Liz pointed out is really important, which is, if you think about it, and we are very interested in having universities and foundations have their endowments invested consistent with mission. And by the way, it's coming. A bill has been proposed twice in Congress for higher education institutions, a Transparency in Endowment Act, where they would have to talk about who manages their money and what are their criteria. And I would love to see a campaign that says, before you write your alumni check, I don't care if it's $10 or $10,000 or $10 million, before you write it, you ought to ask a question. Who's investing that money on behalf of this institution? Who's being helped by it? How much of it goes to scholarships? How much of it goes to supporting the university as opposed to investing in completely unrelated sectors? So I think I would love to see all of that accelerated. And the other thing, if you think about what Liz said, you've got grant-making institutions, and they have 95% of their money. They only have to give 5% away. 95% of their money goes every day to gap-widening businesses, and then they celebrate the 5% where they write grants that are going to try to solve the problems that the 95% of the money is causing. Who do you think is going to win that 95-5, right? And why do we think that that makes any sense at all? But it is when things are assumptions, unquestioned assumptions, we don't challenge them.
Well put, well put. Well, that's what we're here to do today, is challenge the assumptions, is that right? So I think this is a good time to pull up our second prompt here. In our second prompt, as it comes up on the board here, what do you see as the biggest barrier to achieving equity in the Silicon Valley? Is it A, access to capital, B, networks, C, education, D, bias, or E, all of the above? Okay. Bias, number one, access to capital. I think that's a really good transition. So much of the reason that I wanted to transition from kind of that founder's journey and higher up into the ecosystem with deploying capital is knowing some of the challenges that exist at every single level, right? Strive was an organization that helped underrepresented professionals achieve more. We knew that less than 10% of every single organization was represented by Latinx and Black talent. If you go to the leadership ranks, it's less than 5%. If you actually look at, the census, it's closer to 17, 18%, so hugely disproportionate. If you now go to the funders that are funding the organizations, you see that those funders aren't necessarily always funding founders of color or female founders either, as the January Ventures statistics really called out. And then if you go to the highest level above that, about 1.3% of all kind of assets under management are, for all of PE and VC, are actually managed by women or underrepresented fund managers. So let that sink in, right? As you get higher up the funnel, the problem gets increasingly worse. So I'd love to spend a little bit of time now talking about solutions. So we've outlined the problem, a lot of stats that we're throwing your way, but how do we start to solve some of those problems? So Mitch, maybe let's start with you here.
Sure. Well, The great and terrible thing about Silicon Valley, which we're in, is it's a very clubby kind of place. It's all about networks and who you know, and it does lead to very accelerated development because this is the hothouse of, of innovation. But it also absolutely locks out people who are not already part of that network. Okay, so one thing to do, and we did this at Kapor Capital earlier, it was really Freada's idea, I give her credit for this, is to say no warm intro required. Because that's sort of the standard. Mark Andreessen is famous for saying, if you're not smart enough to get a warm intro, I don't want to invest in you. We think that that's both wrong.
I don't want to meet you.
I don't want to meet you. And obnoxious. We put up a system in which anybody can apply. There's a simple but very well thought through form that we ask some questions. We ask people to reflect on their business vis-a-vis our investment criteria specifically about gap closing. And our team goes through several thousand of these a year carefully. And we actually critique our own performance on, are we doing a good job evaluating these and answering? And we have, in fact, funded companies that not only came in over the transom in that way, but where we really didn't have any connection to that we wouldn't otherwise have known. So one way you open things up is you really open things up and give people who don't have that connection a way in the door.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think, was it chapter 12 of the book where you talk about your lessons learned? That's one of them. Like one of the ones that really struck me in the book is when you talk about early stage organizations and the type of talent that they can hire. The type of talent that can take the risk to join an early stage organization is privileged talent, right? The type of talent that can take a risk to sit on your friend's couch for 6 months without an income is privileged talent. So as a founder, I really love the push and urge everybody to read around, hey, what are the ways that you can rethink and get creative around compensation to bring solutions to the table again as well. Freada, would you mind maybe speaking a little bit more to that and some of the solutions on the founder side?
Specifically on talent?
Yeah.
Well, so consistent with the no warm intros, what we are doing is looking systematically at all of the biases that are built into the whole ecosystem and trying to counteract them, trying to remove them, trying to mitigate them to whatever extent we can. And so, for instance, on the compensation issue, you have to think about it that if you've got a mountain of student debt, being part of a startup is not a good idea because you can't service your student loans. So one of the things that we've been doing at Kapor Capital, Kapor Center, Smash, all of the employees, one of the benefits we offer is helping people pay down their student loans. And there are companies and startups, and one that we invested in that actually that is their business. So you can think about these things in kind of systematic ways. We look very much skeptically at pedigrees because they're proxies for privilege. We look instead at distance traveled. How far did you get on your own steam? Where did you start in life? And where have you landed? Solely attributable to your own efforts, not the random birth lottery, I occasionally like to ask audiences, I will ask you, how many of you chose your parents? All righty, so every time you feel proud of what you've accomplished, think about where you started and how many advantages you actually started with. And so what we try to do is get those stories out of our founders because I'll tell you, you learn a lot about grit, about resilience, about persistence, about passion if somebody has had to go through, around a lot of obstacles.
And Liz, what kind of solutions do you tend to think about when you think about fund allocation?
Yeah, one of the things I just wanted to build on something that Freada just said, which is, you have to, when you're not going to invest in something, you have to explain why. And I think if you can get the funnel bigger. So one of the things that we look for is who are we actually meeting with and who are we not meeting with? And if there's areas that we feel like, oh, we're missing a demographic here, that we just don't see them. Why don't we see them? And so then going out and actually trying to get a bigger funnel. Once you do that and you're bringing in folks who maybe don't get capital from you, one of the things that we work really hard at is if we're not going to provide you capital, I'm going to tell you why, and I'm going to tell you how to get it next time. Because a lot of times, you know, a founder will come and present, and they don't get funded. They don't hear anything, and they don't know why. And then that's when you end up with that 71% of people feeling like, oh, you know, it's because I'm a woman, or oh, it's because I'm black. And what you need to do is say, hey, this is why you didn't make the cut this time. But if you do this, this, and this, and you come back, you will get funded. And that gives folks the ability to just change their business model, set up a different caps table, like, you know, thinking through, well, okay, where do I need to get financing before I can come back? And then giving them that opportunity to come back and say, okay, now you're ready, let's go. And I think that's something that we've tried to do. We do it on the philanthropy side all the time. We make a planning grant, say, oh, you know what, I think in 5 years you're going to be ready. We need to do it on the investment side too. And we're trying to build that out.
Exactly. So we can't talk solutions without also talking accountability, right? It's one thing to think about point solutions or systemic solutions, but how do you really create kind of this culture of accountability to make sure that the solutions are measured and followed through with? So perhaps, Liz, let's start with you this time. How do you think about kind of accountability when it comes to implementing some of these solutions?
Yeah, you know, I think one of the things we needed to do in order to move the needle forward, especially on trying to close an equity gap, was to really look at our just investment policy statement. What does it say? What are we focused on? What do we stand for? And I think we took a really hard look and said, okay, we want to invest in more diverse managers. What does that mean? For us, it means a third of the firm is managed by a diverse manager. It's a lower standard than others, but we've done a ton of research that says that 1/3 is the tipping point to creating more equity. And so we've taken that stance and we've said, okay, we're going to hold ourselves accountable. We're going to look at it every year. We're going to see if we're making progress. I think we're at the point where we've made a good progress, and so now we're saying, okay, how do we influence the field? How do we push our investment consultant? How do we say, hey guys, there's a lot of, we're not your only client. You know, you like to hold us up as this very, you know, managing a lot of diverse funds, but what are you doing to push your other clients? And trying to really move the ecosystem in that direction, because I think if we're all sitting here alone and we're the only ones, you can only make so much progress. You need to like really push the field.
And maybe for the two of you, when you think about Kapor Capital, what are some mechanisms that you've explored to help hold founders accountable and help them hold themselves accountable?
The founders commitment? Yeah. In January of 2016, so a long time already, it'll be 8 years in a couple of months, we implemented what we think is the first founders commitment in venture capital. And since January 2016, Kapor Capital has not written a check to a founder who doesn't make a commitment to building a diverse team and an inclusive culture. And if they take the check, and it's not a check the box exercise, it is not a quota, it is, we help them. We do workshops, we do one-to-one support. What we ask is that a founder think about who are your customers, and does your employee demographics, do those look like your customers? Because if you think about it, it's just smart business to have people who are building your product and advertising your products and services look like and reflect the customers. So that's one of the things. And so sometimes we'll have people say, I'll get to that later, I'll get to that later. And then they come and they're raising another round and we say, oh, we'll get to writing you a check later. If you're not going to follow through on it. One other quick accountability, I want to give credit. So Mitch and I have stepped back as GPs of Kapor Capital, And the firm is now run by our two younger partners who've been with us since 2011, basically since we started down this road, Brian Dixon and Liliana Vakpori. They went out and raised $127 million for Kapor Capital III, making it one of the largest Black-led VC funds. We're incredibly proud of them. We still have lots and lots of companies that, from the earlier era, so we meet with them regularly, but they've made some absolutely fabulous investments. Right after George Floyd was murdered, Brian wrote a blog post because all of us got a ton of inbound. Quick, I need to write a check to a black entrepreneur. Where do you find a black entrepreneur? Mitch likes to say.
Well, I got some anyway. I was tempted to say, the issue is you've been looking in aisle 12 and you really want to be looking at aisle 6.
Yeah,
Oh,
maybe in 7, we're over there too.
Doesn't
Yeah.
work like that.
But Brian wrote a blog post called So You Want to Fund Black Entrepreneurs. He basically said, hold up a mirror and start with your own firm. Because the people, and this is Liz's point too, the people who sit at the investment table, who they are has a huge impact on who gets funded. And there's plenty of rigorous data about the race, ethnicity, gender of check writers has everything to do with who is a check recipient at the other end, who gets the business. And so one of the things Brian said is start posting your partner jobs. Don't just tap your old B school buddy. No more of the kind of warm intro stuff. So 2 firms initialized on the West Coast and first round on the East Coast, both very highly regarded VC firms, read Brian's blog, posted for the first time ever their partner jobs, and for the first time ever, both of those firms hired their first black partner and gave Brian public credit for that. Now, I kind of think, isn't venture capital supposed to be on the cutting edge? Since when is posting a job cutting edge? But okay, we'll take
somewhere.
it. We'll take it. So I do think there's some really basic things. Again, look from the outside in. Look at where are the biases in your assumptions and think about doing things differently.
When we think about on the organizational level, I'd like to actually double click there a bit. Have you seen any kind of best in class examples of corporations and organizations that actually have thought about inclusion really thoughtfully and implemented some great practices?
Yes, but. There are many companies that have done all kinds of great kind of initiatives, whether it's ERGs, whether it's whatever it might be. But let's get real. Chief Diversity Officer jobs got cut more than any other job category in the last 12 to 18 months. Mm-hmm. So again, if it's not baked in, it's like the buy one, give one away. If you can sever it off, you haven't done a good job.
Great. Well, let's pull ahead. I mean, we started a little bit about how you got started in this work, how your values brought you to this work. We talked a little bit through some of the solutions to the problems that we see in the ecosystem. Now let's look ahead. I'll start by saying this as the eternal optimist in the group. Are you all optimistic about what the future has in store as we look to continue to close gaps?
I'm more hopeful than optimistic. I mean, hope is something you can always be. Sometimes optimism is not warranted by the circumstances. But hope is a kind of, I just heard this, hope is a discipline, and I think that's right. You can look for ways that you can make a difference. And if you look to the history of movements of social justice and change, big ones that have really changed the world, they are none of them overnight. They're all multi-generational. I came to this late in life, learned a lot from Freada, so my reading of, let's say, the history of the civil rights movement is actually pretty current, and I mean within the last decade. And I was really surprised to learn about the foundational work that was done in the 1910s, the foundation of the NAACP by the way, blacks and Jews, something that has been forgotten, and the work of Thurgood Marshall in the 30s and 40s with the litigation, and those battles are still being fought a century later. So I don't think we're entitled, even though we may not be entitled to be optimistic now, we're not entitled to despair. All of these battles are multi-generational, maybe even centuries, and you always look for some way today that you can actually make a constructive difference, and you just keep at it.
Totally, totally. What was the quote in the book, Freada? That we hope that the long tail of the Silicon Valley bends towards justice. Is that right?
The arc.
The arc.
The arc.
That's right. Liz, what about yourself?
Yeah, I think I'm resonating with what you just said, because there's areas where I feel despair and where I feel worried, because with the recent Supreme Court decisions, I feel like people who wanted cover have it. And folks who don't want to move forward, who want to stick with the status quo, they have something that they can kind of hang their hat on and say, oh, can't do it now, we're going to have to wait. And so I just want to make sure that we continue, those of us who are really trying to get this work done, just continue to push and say, no, it's not okay to stop. It's not okay to take that cover and say, okay, we don't have to do it now. Maybe in 5 years, maybe in 10 years. Let's see how this all settles out. That's not the time for now. The time for now is not to take 2 steps forward and 3 steps back. It's to take 2 steps forward and 2 more steps forward, and then watch and see if they can push us back.
Well put, well put. And so just a quick public service announcement. This will be kind of the last question to the panel before we invite the audience to ask some Q&A. So tee up your questions now. Let's change gears a little bit since we're looking towards the future. The future is now, and it's called AI. How do you see AI kind of informing this conversation in the present and in the future?
Well, we are very hopeful, to your last question, about AI and the way to leverage AI for good. Most of the conversation has been hand-wringing about, and there are a lot of good reasons to wring your hands about AI and about bias and about its misuse and about deep fakes and the need for guardrails and regulation. And we can't forget that AI also can, unbelievably, we've seen it in our own companies, accelerate and scale good in the same way that it can accelerate and scale harm. And so we can't throw out the good stuff or the potential for.
Absolutely.
We have hired 2 very good AI engineers at Kapor Center Investments, which is the body that supports the 30-plus venture funds that we're in, including Kapor Capital. Specifically, and this is part of Troy's day job.
Miles and Felipe, if you're watching from home, hello.
But we think it is imperative that our companies, and the ones we've invested in directly and the ones that the funds we've invested in have invested in, learn as quickly as possible to get up the learning curve to understand how to incorporate these technologies into the core of their products, how to avoid and overcome the pitfalls, because this training is on it's on the internet at large, which is full of bias, and if you don't take steps specifically to counteract that, you're going to be doing harm. But we're making an investment to help the companies and funds we're involved with utilize this, while at the same time really supporting the notion that we do need to have prudent and immediate regulation to prevent the abuses.
Absolutely, absolutely. Liz?
Yeah, I agree. With all the hand-wringing, I also feel kind of optimistic about AI, because I feel like there's a real opportunity for democratization, lowering the cost of doing business, and creating accessible opportunities and accessibility for folks who before would have had to put in a more significant cost to get a business or a technology up and running. AI kind of, for all of the potential pitfalls, and there are many, and I think that we absolutely agree with Mitch for everything he said, but I do think there's also the positive that sometimes gets overwrought. Like, there is a chance to democratize the way we build things. There is a chance to really think about accessibility, and AI can enhance biases, but AI could also reduce biases if we set it up right. And so I think there's real opportunity there, and we're just on the bleeding edge.
Absolutely, absolutely. So let's turn to our audience here. You all have so diligently written a plethora of questions. So let me start with the first one. What is the most gap narrowing company you have funded? And I believe this is for Mitch and Freada.
Which of your children do you love the most? Is that the question? I could give an example of a company that we think is at the highest tier of gap closing. It has a bunch of companies in our portfolio, but not enough time to talk about it. This is a company called Promise, founded by Phaedra Ellis-Lampkins. On the one hand, you could look at it as it's payment systems for people to interact with the government to pay things, which seems very unexciting. But if you look at what happened during the pandemic with tens of millions of people falling behind and unable to pay their utility bills, their water, their electric, and it couldn't be shut off, but there's enormous amounts of debt. None of the solutions in the market to help people catch up on that were being adopted or used. Phaedra's perspective, having grown up in a low-income family, a single working mom, and feeling the sting of what it meant to be singled out as poor when she had to stand in a separate lunch line for the kids getting free or reduced lunch. Her insight was, look, if you simply treat low-income individuals with dignity and respect and make it easy for them to set the terms of catching up on their payments, they will do that. A radical hypothesis that there was skepticism about, but when they ran the pilot in Louisville, 95% of companies repaid, of individuals, caught up on their payments. It created revenue for the utilities and municipalities they didn't expect to have. It improved people's credit ratings, and it made the whole system work well. And it's a simple mobile app that you can use that just treats you the way people ought to be treated, and nobody had done that in that space at all. And now they have a $100 million pipeline of business. So that would be at the highest tier of gap narrowing, gap closing.
That's amazing. Yeah, give it up for Phaedra. Give it up. Now the other end of that spectrum, it's actually a great follow-on is maybe what's one of the biggest failures that you all have had along the journey, and what did you learn from it? Don't all go at once, please.
No, there's a lot of company in that tier also. I mean, anyone who knows VC understands that there's a significant number of companies that don't work for one reason or another. And we haven't been asked that question on stage, but we're going to.
No, we will think about it. Well, I'll tell you, sometimes a company, so there are certain categories of companies that most venture capitalists kill off because they don't grow fast enough. We don't do that. We have a number of companies that are probably not going to hit venture scale, but they're doing good in the world. They're creating jobs. They're cash flow positive. They're profitable. They're just not going to, not going to IPO. That's fine with us. That's not generally fine in the VC world. So some people would call those failures. We actually don't. Some of the companies we've invested in have, and there was one company, an ed tech company, that was gap closing, and that the founder discovered that she could make a lot more money if she became a gap widening company. And she was making a ton of money. And we asked for our money back. We said, we're not. So it's a failure in our mind to become gap widening, and so we did get our investment back.
But let me add a little bit, because it's a fair question, and I don't want to paint the picture that we have found the magic formula that makes us smarter than all the other investors. When we do very early stage, anybody does very early stage. In my life now, I've done several hundred of these, if we go all the way back. You're dealing with enormous uncertainty because you have a founder who has an idea. Maybe they have a little bit of code. Maybe they don't. Maybe it's in a market that doesn't even exist. And so you're making bets of all kinds that the market will develop, that a product can actually be produced, that the founder's integrity is sufficiently high that they're going to do what they say they're going to do, and on and on and on. And we look at our failures and ask, which wrong call did we make? And are we systematically making too many of the wrong call in a certain direction that we need to make an adjustment on? And I would say, for me, just speaking personally, lately, while I still love and want the compelling narrative, and we've been talking about the narrative, we want someone with distance travel, we want something to be, gap closing, and so on and so forth, we should not do that in any sense to the detriment of the hardcore economic fundamentals. And it's a little easy to, VCs fall in love with their companies. And so if we're going to make some correction, if I were talking to the investment team, I would say, have we also really looked objectively in the cold light of day at the economics of this now and in the future as a balance to the gap closing, distance travel kind of narratives? Because when we haven't done that, that's when we've made more mistakes.
Absolutely. And I love that question because the spirit of that question is very much the spirit of the topic that we're talking about, right? Equity is not, it would be a disservice to say that we could solve these problems overnight. We're going to make mistakes as we try to solve these problems, but allyship is about how quickly you bounce back from those mistakes and are able to live to see another day. So I thought that was a particularly kind of important question to ask. But moving on, Liz, actually, there's a specific question for you here. How did the culture of SVCF evolve to support investing in diverse funds?
That's a great question. It's we actually have been doing it for more than a decade. So far, I get to stand on the shoulders of genius. So it's a nice place to be. I believe that we had an investment committee member who had a vision, Thurman White, and he helped the Silicon Valley really get a focus on. It was really important to, I think it was that, let's call it the Hippocratic Oath, that if your investments are widening gaps, it makes your grant making that much harder to try to close them. And the investment committee and our board stood behind for the last decade trying to make sure that we were including diverse investments. And the only reason I can sit here and say it's 61% is because it's been a very, very long process that's taken more than a decade. And we have just continued and continued and continued to look and find. And then that has become a little bit self-fulfilling because once that word of mouth and that network gets out there, people start to come out of the woodwork and say, hey, I have a fund. And they'll come to us and say, like, I'm a diverse manager. Can you at least get me to the next phase of diligence? So that's what we've tried to do. But it's been a long, long road. Absolutely, absolutely.
Another question from the Q&A here. In general, would you favor investing, and I have a feeling Freada has a point of view on this one, would you favor investing in a social enterprise structured as a Delaware public benefit corporation over a traditional C Corp or S Corp?
We actually encourage our founders to consider being public benefit corps, not B Corps. We're not a fan of being a B Corp.
And they're two different things.
Two different legal structures. B Corp is sort of voluntary and you meet or don't meet certain criteria. Public benefit corp is to redo your charter that says you have a mandate to pay attention to your public good as well as your financial returns. It offers protection for founders because what we've discovered over the years is that we can lead a pre-seed, we can lead a seed stage. By the time we might even do a pro rata in the A, by the time as they're successful, they need to raise a Series B. Well, there are fewer gap closing focused or impact focused Series B folks that are going to lead Series B. So often what we hear from our founders is the term sheet says I have to take impact out of my deck. The term sheet says I have to stop focusing on diversity. What do I do? If you're a PBC, you say, well, look, this is built into the core of our business. This is what you're investing in. So there's a little bit of protection there.
And interestingly, we surveyed our entire portfolio, at least a half a dozen, somewhere between 5 and 10 public benefit corporations. None of them had found it an impediment to downstream fundraising.
And some have found it an advantage.
Yeah.
It's a very strong signal, and it means that they're not wasting their time pitching people who aren't really interested, who are only interested in their financial returns.
That's great. That's great. I have a great question here. Who is the one person who has influenced you most to your current views?
Oh, in my case, it's Freada. For sure. No, I'm a tech entrepreneur, but I wouldn't have done this entire chapter of my professional life had she not been encouraging me and nudging me.
Okay, anyone else?
Well, for me, I mean, it's a whole series of people for going back many, many decades about who did I learn about racial justice from, who did I learn about social justice from, just sort of. So it's not a person, but it's many, many people. In terms of understanding technology and the ways in which technology can be used for good and how exciting technology is, that's this guy.
That's great. Another great question here. My father was a poor immigrant who fought to become successful in Silicon Valley. What made me successful was my upbringing. Why not back home culture?
Why not?
Why not back home culture?
I'm not sure I understand that.
Yeah, actually, as I read it, I'm not sure I quite understand that one either. So maybe we go to the next one. We'll keep it here. What might your next book be?
My next book will be what I did during retirement.
That's great. Great. And then for Liz, explain SVCF and how the DAFs are guided to learn more about gap closing.
Great. So we have about 1,000 DAFs that are with SVCF, and
Does everyone know what a DAF is?
a donor advised fund. So the community foundation is made up of families who have philanthropic intent. So folks who want to give back, and maybe they don't have enough money to have a foundation, or they don't want to run a foundation because those are really, really, really hard to run. And so they'll come to us and they'll set up this thing called a donor advised fund, which we believe democratizes giving. It allows everybody to be a philanthropist. Our minimum size for a DAF is $5,000. So we're willing to just have anybody come and work with us to try to improve Silicon Valley. And so every time somebody sets up a DAF, we'll assign them with a donor engagement person whose job is to meet them where they are. What are the things that you care about? Do you care about kids? Do you care about K through 12 education? Do you care about the environment? And we try to bring them opportunities to both meeting what they want to do and also trying to introduce them to new concepts. Like, you've been really into K through 12, but did you know that one of the biggest gaps in the Bay Area is early childhood education and early childhood care? And it's holding back the Valley because people can't work because they can't find care for their kids. And so trying to take people from what they're interested in and introduce them to new concepts, but also to help them do what they're doing even better.
That's great. Thanks so much. Another question here. How might educational institutions contribute to the solution in closing the gap?
Well, one way is in terms of being much more closely aligned between the people who are teaching, the people who are administrators, and the chief investment officers, and having those much more tightly interwoven. I think chief investment officers ought to be measured on a lot more than financial returns. If you only evaluate somebody on financial returns, that's what they're going to go for. And I think that's part of the problem and keeps that flywheel going, in my opinion, in the wrong direction. I want to go back. I think that if I understand correctly about the home culture, I think that there is a point about the culture of the home, and especially in an immigrant family in that example, matters a lot. And we certainly do see that. We have, I don't know where Alberto is. Oh, thank you. We do have a SMASH scholar, a high school junior with us from our SMASH program that I started 20 plus years ago, Summer Math and Science Honors. It is a program for underrepresented high school students of color, half girls, for all 20 plus years from low income schools. It's on many campuses, started at Berkeley, but is on many campuses in the US. One of the things that we do is we involve the families, we involve the parents, and they come to visit the kids. It's been a residential summer program, although COVID kind of upended that for a while, because we think involving the whole family, getting the whole family used to the idea that you are making an investment in your child to let them go to college, because these are pretty much first-gen college students. And then there's a company that we've done a direct investment in recently, Paloma, and you might want to say anything about Paloma and how they involve parents.
Yeah. So Paloma is an organization started by a founder who had a nonprofit. His nonprofit started summer school programs to get kids up to reading level. And he said, hey, why not insert technology into that interaction to encourage parents to spend 15 minutes at home with their kids, studying up to get them up to reading level, to get them up to math level, et cetera. That is a terrific example, really, of kind of infusing this kind of gap closing methodology into the education pipeline. So we're really thrilled to have made that investment, excited to see where he goes. Great. Well, with that, we are closing in on closing time here. So I'm going to maybe ask that in true Computer History Museum fashion, everybody kind of pull up their cards here.
Start.
I will start. So the true tradition here is, what is kind of one word that you would use to kind of describe your legacy and your approach? Mine is empower. I think, as I said before, like my goal is to help underrepresented, use technology to help empower underrepresented communities. So empower is going to be the word that I'll use and close on.
And in true fashion, I didn't follow the rules. I have two words, but they are hyphenated. I invented the hyphen between them. They're really two words, I know. And mine is distance traveled. And I think I've explained how passionately I feel about that as a much better measure of talent.
So my word is openness in many senses, in the sense of open source, open access, but also in the sense of being open to ideas, including being open to ideas of other people that you disagree with.
And my word is start. You can start today. Even if you can't invest in private equity or venture capital, you can think about what bank you're using. And you can say, is this bank that I'm using widening the gap, or is it closing the gap? Am I funding nonprofits that are widening the gap or closing the gap? Think through what you're doing in your day-to-day. You can start today, and you can start small, but something small can grow over time.
That's a terrific note to end on. And as my grandmother used to say, movement creates momentum. So at the end of the day, just move. Thank you so much, folks.
Thank you.
Go collect these, I think.
Thank you, and thanks everyone for coming and those watching online. Troy, you did a wonderful job, and Freada, Mitch, and Liz. This really was like a living room conversation. Talk about community and really just a very nice and warm handoff on a really important topic. And I'm glad the question was asked of Liz about the Silicon Valley Community Foundation. I was on the board there for 8 years, and I came on with Thurman, who drove that conversation a long time ago. And as Liz pointed out, depending upon your financial situation, you can start today, and it's a $5,000 opportunity, and you can learn a lot about how to make an impact. And that can obviously grow into your own culture and your family as well. So thank you for that. Well, with that in mind, I want to ask you all to join me one more time in a round of applause for the panel. So I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you.